Hi, everybody. I'd like to say it was me, but that was the quietest the room has ever...
Really?
Most quickly the room has ever become quiet when I've ever been involved in anything, but I know it has nothing to do with me.
I'm not sure that's good.
Minister, thank you very much for being here with us today. I'm sure after 3 years in politics, you've heard many times the former British Prime Minister's Harold Macmillan's comment of what he feared the most in politics, and it was, events, dear boys, events. So I would be remiss if I did not start our conversation on competitiveness by asking you about the pipeline. Your government, I know, has pledged to meet the Kinder Morgan deadline, so interested to hear from you how that's going to happen.
Okay. Well, so good afternoon. In case you hadn't heard, we're in support of TMX. So that message, I think, has gone out pretty loud and clear over the last few days. But we think over the longer term, what we've clearly said to Canadians is that after you go through a robust environmental assessment, after you consider the issues on the table, after you make sure that you've protected against the challenges, when the federal government makes a decision to move forward on a project, we need to be able to do that. So we have said really clearly that Canada is a place where, to be effective, we need to have an effective rule of law. We need to clearly be able to enunciate what's in our best interests and to move forward. So in this case, what we've said and what we will say in our upcoming meetings with the premiers of Alberta and British Columbia is we are resolved to move forward on this project. We have the federal tools to do that. We will be, of course, discussing how to do that with the project proponent. But
and that's Alberta, you mean, as the or Kinder?
I mean Kinder Morgan. And what I can say here is that those discussions are already underway. I don't have the opportunity to give you more details because we do need to get through those discussions to find the right approach to ensuring that this is delivered on behalf of Canadians. It's really, as we all know, about creating a great economy and great jobs. So that's the challenge in front of us. We've stated it clearly. And I won't be able to go into the details of those discussions because, of course, we need to get this right for Canadians.
One of the things I think that this has reminded us is the fragility of sometimes our federation, which we've probably taken a bit more for granted in the last number of years. Can you just talk a bit about where you see the room for compromise among all the parties that are involved?
I think what we would say is that we are at a stage where we've identified the approach to dealing with the issues that came up during the assessment process. Mm-hmm. So we've put in place an oceans protection plan that is meeting the most robust standards. We've heard, obviously, from people in BC that they're pleased with specific elements of that. But more importantly, what we're trying to say is that this needs to move forward. The idea of compromise, I would put it a different way. I would say that there may be ways that we need to address some of the risks that were unexpected, and I would say that is a zone for discussion, so that we can think about the fact that it's taken longer, think about the fact that has real financial implications, because we do, again, thinking about our broader goal of ensuring that we have the rule of law, ensuring that we get these tens of thousands of jobs. We don't want to do that years out. We're aiming to do that in the time frame that's been laid out, or very nearly that time frame. And that's what we're aspiring to do, dealing with those, what I would call those risks.
Now, how confident are you that you'll be able to come to a solution that satisfies everybody that's involved?
We live in a democracy, so every single person in the country isn't happy with every single decision we take. I have learned something over the last 3 years. What I can say is that the desired outcome, I'm highly confident we have the federal tools at our disposal to move forward in an area of federal jurisdiction to get this project done. and we have resolved to do that. The Prime Minister's made that statement. We're making it again here today. We're going to discuss with all interested parties so that we can get to that outcome, and we will need to listen along the way, but that is the outcome that we will achieve.
Okay, last question on this, we'll move on to other things. If you are unsuccessful at meeting that deadline, because it is soon upon us, would you consider co-investing with Alberta and building the pipeline as governments?
So I said I'd learned some things in 3 years. So
you're not.
So the first thing, of course, is everyone's not happy. The second is hypothetical questions are pretty dangerous territory. But I wouldn't accept your hypothetical. I would say that we are going to get this done. And the method to do that, there is more work to be done. It has to meet tests that people would expect are reasonable tests. First and foremost, as I mentioned, the high level of test is, can Canada get things done that are in its national interest? We need to do this. The second test is, are we going to be able to drive the economic advantage? And that includes the timing. The third test, of course, is that anything we come up with has to be discussed and agreed to in a way that meets up to the expectations that Canadians have, is that we're doing things in a fiscally responsible way. We will consider all of those issues as we move forward, but failure is not an option. We're going to get this done.
Well, thank you. Moving away from events to thinking a bit more about the long-term development of the competitiveness and prosperity agenda in Canada, you've now delivered 3 budgets to Canadians. Thank you for that. The first one was centered a lot on children and child tax benefits. The second was about innovation, and the third was about gender. Your government has obviously spoken a lot about shared growth, inclusive growth, and obviously it's a wonkish room, so we've all heard about the middle class. I wonder if you could go beyond those framings and describe where you're trying to take the country to through your budgets.
So I think it's a great question for us to talk about where we're trying to go. I wouldn't have necessarily identified those specific initiatives of what the budgets we're trying to do. I would say in the first instance, coming into office, what we were trying to ensure is that we increase the level of confidence among Canadians. We saw a level of anxiety around long-term outcomes for Canadians and their families. We talked about middle-class anxiety in particular, with a recognition that if people don't feel like the growth is helping them and their families, then it's hard for them to be engaged in doing what they need to see those benefits through. So really it was about developing the kind of confidence we needed in order to make the long-term decisions that we know are going to be in the best interests of the country. So the themes around investment and innovation, I think, started at the beginning. The themes around gender inclusiveness, which is important to consider in the context of making sure everyone has a real and fair chance at making an impact on our economy, really started from day one as well. So that confidence is what allows us to take those long-term decisions that we know are in the best interests of the country. And I will say that after this budget, I haven't had anyone come to me and say, it was a bad idea to invest in science and research for the long-term success of our country. I really haven't had anyone in the course of our first 2.5 years in office come to me and say, that idea that you're going to invest in infrastructure in order to make sure that we have a better system of roads, better systems of wastewater, more infrastructure that can support people in housing in our big cities. No one's come to me to say that these are bad ideas. The idea that we're going to focus on the long term is absolutely something that we get full support for. What I think we do need to do is maintain that level of confidence along the way. We're in a particularly good news situation right now. I know there's anxiety among business leaders, probably among people in this room, about some of the issues that we're facing around the world. But I don't think anyone would argue that we're not in a good place to consider those issues given the nature of our employment situation in this country right now, the lowest unemployment we've seen since 1976, given the growth rate we've seen over the last year and a half. So it's not to dismiss the challenges, but it's to say that starting from there, which really was developed through a combination of greater confidence among Canadians, through, of course, tightening global growth, which is positive, and a couple of other factors, that puts us in a good place to consider what do we do next to maintain the confidence among Canadians broadly, but among the business community who needs to have confidence that we can what I would say is remain competitive, because we don't want to ever say that we're not competitive, but remain competitive and successful.
I'm wondering, given you're among friends, so to speak, I'd be interested.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one before.
Yeah, I know, exactly. I was wondering if you'd say anything.
The other one people say is, I'm not going to quote you.
Okay, well, I promise I won't. Others may. There's been a lot of ambition in what you've just spoken to us about, in what you're trying to achieve and trying to address some of those long-term challenges. I'd be interested to just hear what, if you were to give those budgets a report card, what you would say as a whole, what you would say.
I get to grade myself.
You can grade yourself.
Okay.
And in particular, talk about the couple of things that went better than you expected, and the couple of things that haven't worked quite as well as you expected, and how you plan to address those as you go forward.
Well, let's start with my ability to grade myself. Yeah. I won't grade myself or our government on the budgets. What I will do, though, is say that where we are right now is, I think, I see like Craig sitting over there, or there's others in this room who would have been sitting with us in the economist meeting that we had before budgets back in early 2016, before our first budget. And I would hazard a guess that there isn't any of those people who, if they were honest with themselves, would have said in the beginning of 2016 that what we would have seen between then and now is 600,000 new jobs, is growth rates over the course of that period after the oil started picking up a little bit, that would be at the rate that we've seen them. So those, I got to say that from any reasonable report card, those measures are critically important. I think that the way I look at the things that have not gone as rapidly as we'd want, you can probably identify them. I hear Dominic Barton was here this morning, he was talking about the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Would I like us to have already put in place the first project? Of course. My view, though, is that that's well on its way and we're making progress, but we always want to do things in the time frame that we start out aspiring to do them, and that's one that we're working to get done in the time frame of 2018 in a way that makes an impact.
So the hope is that there'll be shovels in the ground by...
Well, I'm not sure that we ever aspire to shovels in the ground through the Infrastructure Bank in 2018. What we aspire to is the I's dotted and the T's crossed on a deal that we're actually taking on a big infrastructure project together with outside investors, as opposed to that next step. But while we're on the subject of infrastructure, of course, getting infrastructure done in this country when we have to do bilateral agreements with every province takes some time, and you need to do it right. You can't fast forward and say that we're going to move forward more rapidly than we can without getting the municipalities on board and the provinces on board for big decisions that are going to be important long-term for the country. So that's some place where we're now getting more and more traction. We've seen significant investments, certainly of the first stage, and now in our second stage of infrastructure, we're moving forward. But I want to see that continue to move rapidly. So again, big picture, what people would ask me is, are you feeling good about where we are? Yes. The economy is doing as well or better than we expected. Do we know yet exactly how we will deal with what people are framing as issues around competitiveness presented to us really from, in most part, from outside our country? Mm-hmm. No, we're working through that. We're listening, and we're going to get to that.
Yeah. You mentioned there were a couple things, and my fault for interrupting with another question, but a couple of areas that hadn't gone quite as well as you'd hoped. So if one, or maybe as quickly, so if one is infrastructure, are there others that you're sort of looking to pick up on that might have not flowed quite as you'd hoped?
Well, if we went through every single line item, I could certainly give you a sense of, is this moving quite as rapidly or more slowly than we would hope, and we'd be able to grade each one of them. But I think that's not the right way for me to evaluate. I really do think we need to say, is the economy going the way we want? Are Canadians working? Are people, that confidence that's generated from that 600,000 additional people working, that's huge, and that's the sort of really big picture measure that I think we need to remain focused on. And so thinking about those big projects, whether it's the Trans Mountain expansion or new projects, they're going to help with that over the longer term. Those are the big measures. I mean, it sounds mundane, but Canada does work when Canadians are working. I mean, that does help our economy significantly, and that's what we're really proud of.
So B+?
Well, I'm self-grading, so I'd have to start with an A+, but if you force us to go to a B++,
okay.
Maybe we'll take that.
We can compromise on that.
Okay, yeah.
You mentioned Dominic Barton, in addition to the comments about the infrastructure bank. He also talked about the critical importance of reskilling. And in fact, of all the recommendations in the Growth Council report, he underscored that one as probably the most critical. He also said, though, that when they scanned the world, no one was doing this well and at scale, and that we had about 5 years to get it right. So what should we do?
Well, first of all, let me agree with the diagnosis. We, at the G7 meetings that we had last year, led by Italy, this was a key theme that we talked about together. And what was pretty clear is that, as you said, nobody has any secret sauce on how we're going to deal with the impact of the kind of automation that we've never seen before. We're going to have that as a central part of our discussions as well. We have some ideas on how we can get there, clearly by spending an awful lot more on labor market development agreements with the provinces. We do increase the amount of training available in the short term. I'm not arguing that's a silver bullet, it's not. One of the recommendations of the Economic Advisory Council was to put in place sort of a skills organization, which he probably identified, I wasn't here.
He did, yep.
Which we're moving forward with in this time period, so that's moving forward on pace.
He actually did note that you said it wasn't ambitious enough.
Well, that's my view. I mean, I think the challenge is huge, and I think you identify the world, collectively in industrialized countries, don't have this solved by any stretch. And I mean, some of the ideas they were thinking about, ideas like, setting up separate training funds through mechanisms, ideas that they had, are interesting ideas to ponder. We're not there yet, but I would say that this is something that animates us and something we need to keep thinking about, because this idea that Canadians will be confident is only true if they see that we're helping to identify ways that their kids can move from one job to another when that happens for an increasingly large percentage of the population.
When you look at the data, one of the laggards in this area are corporations, and who underinvest compared to a lot of their global peers in workforce development and training. How much is that a concern, and do you think government can do anything to try to incent perhaps greater investment from corporate Canada?
I think corporate Canada does have a huge role in this regard. I don't know the statistic that you just said, whether that's broadly.
Someone on Twitter will correct me if I'm wrong, probably.
But I will say that I increasingly hear from business leaders that as they're thinking about the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence on their business, that they are actually on purpose thinking in advance how much they need to advance in retraining, and if not retraining for their business, just retraining with generalized skills. So I'm starting to see business leaders step to the fore on this. We don't have any initiatives that we've been thinking about in terms of being directive in that regard, but clearly we're going to need to work together, because the issues, the quote that the Prime Minister made at Davos was, we are moving faster today than we've ever been moving, and when we look back, this will be the slowest we've ever moved. And I mean, I think it does sort of remind us that we're moving so much faster than we were a decade ago, and it's only going to get more challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll look forward to see if that might become a theme of a future budget. This question is a little bit more personal, and it's really about how you see your role as finance minister in this government. When you look, to be a bit simple about it, but if you look back over the history of relationships between prime ministers and finance ministers, so whether it's Chrétien and Martin or Flaherty Harper, Wilson, Mulrooney, it tends to be that the finance minister sort of holds the line on the purse pretty tightly, and the prime minister and the cabinet are the ones really advancing the agenda. You seem to have a more activist approach. So I guess I'm curious, A, is that characterization correct? And then just B, more generally, would love to hear how you think about your role as a finance minister, and given all the nature and pace of change, does that role need to evolve?
That's an interesting one. So let me start by acknowledging the dynamics. So the dynamics are always going to be that when people around the cabinet table are charged with getting things done, they're going to come up with great ideas, and those great ideas are going to cost money. And there will need to be a prioritization of those ideas. It's just the way it works. It's quite familiar for people working in business. So that is a dynamic that happens. The role of the finance minister absolutely has to be to think about the long-term trend of spending, the long-term trend of investment, and dealing with those things, including having available funds for contingencies. And contingencies can be pretty big because the economy does go through periods of challenge. So I, in my role, do see it as one of the key things is maintaining that discipline over the long term. What we won't do, though, is necessarily accept the frame that we think about things in a really short-term time frame. So in thinking about that long term, we're thinking, how do we do things responsibly? How do we make sure that we are, as the economy grows, reducing the size of what is now, a significant investment that's more than we might have originally expected based on changing economic situations. So that goal is always going to be paramount for any finance minister. In my personal situation, I guess I see my role as very much thinking about the long term. So thinking about what are those long-term issues that we're facing together. So big picture demographic change is a critically important issue that we need to think about. We're going to have fewer workers per retiree, and it's going to continue to decline, and that is a very significant challenge. It presents issues around how we engage as much of the population as we can in success, and that informs things like our approach to ensuring that women are successful, how we can make sure that Indigenous Canadians have more capacity to be meeting up to the objectives that they want to have for themselves. So that long-term objective is important. And then in meeting that also, we're thinking about those long-term investments. So it is being a steward of the investments that we know are going to have an impact over the long term. The simplest one to describe is infrastructure. But other investments, obviously, like the ones you're talking about this morning around the investments in particular industries or sectors where we have differentiated advantage. So you can't, if you're intending to be a finance minister, only think about the expense side of the equation. You need to think about what are the opportunities for growth. Mm-hmm. And if we can have 0.1% more growth, 0.2% more growth in real terms, that's a significant impact over the long term of our country, and certainly will make a big difference in terms of job opportunities and how we get through this challenging dynamic of changing jobs. So I would say you got to be on both those sides, and one dynamic, at least in our government, is the Prime Minister and I have a very close relationship in talking about these things. He's not at all disengaged from thinking about those same issues. He's attached to the same long-term goals of fiscal responsibility, but recognizes that we can't cut our way to success. We need to think about how we invest for the long term, and we're together in that regard. I think the most successful of prime ministers and finance ministers working together is when they are working together, and I can say in our government that's happening.
It's good to hear. I'll just remind the audience we do have Slido, so if people have any questions they would like to ask the minister, please feel free to use it. And apparently,
I love this. It says gender equality is a fundamental part of Canada's economic.
Everyone in the room agrees.
85% agree.
Who are the 10%?
It's a good starting point. We should identify who are the 15% who think it's not a good idea.
So exactly. Please raise your hands. I want to ask you, you mentioned earlier about some of the questions to our competitiveness that come from the outside. Now, part of those are obviously labor market changes. Another one I must mention, of course, is the U.S. tax cuts. There's been a lot of discussion on the rate, but arguably the more important thing to be talking about is actually the structural changes to what is being taxed now in the U.S. and how that might affect us. So, for example, there are a number of changes that dramatically reduce the cost of capital for the U.S., other ones to provide incentive for things like locating IP in the U.S., particularly for U.S.-based multinational companies. Yes. You have said that the department is monitoring these the potential impacts. So I'm interested if you can speak to what precisely you are monitoring and what you would need to see to feel like we have to have a response.
So I would go farther than saying we're monitoring. I mean, we've as you say, the devil is in the details. So it's the tax rate change from what was a sticker price of 35% in the United States down to a sticker price of 21%. When you add up state and federal taxes, is more like 26%, versus when you add up provincial and federal taxes in Canada, more like 27%. So that's a big difference in terms of our competitive advantage, but it does put us in a close zone. Mm-hmm. Our small business tax rates, of course, are still significantly less than the United States. They've changed their approach in a lot of ways that we need to think about the ups and downs of that. They've changed they've given accelerated capital cost depreciation for 5 years, but they've changed the expensing on research and development costs in a way that's worse than where we're at. They've changed so the way people are taxed in small businesses goes through and they get the personal tax rate. So there's a number of changes that we need to analyze. We are doing that. We're also trying to figure out what it means for different sectors of the Canadian economy. It's not a similar impact for different sectors. So we are actively engaged in that process.
Which sectors are you most concerned about?
Well, I think as you look at the changes that they've made, you can see some of the places where it would have an impact. One change that you mentioned in the intellectual property area is they've made it such that you're going to have a global minimum tax on American companies, which means, for example, in Canada, some of our programs like our SHRED program, which Canadian businesses really like. If you're a U.S. business using some of those advantages, you might not have those advantages anymore because the minimum tax could make them less advantageous. So there's some complexity involved in considering how we approach this. Some things are more straightforward. Some things might take longer to get at. What I would say, though, is that as we think about Canadian competitiveness, we don't just think about it in terms of tax rates. Like many people in this room, I ran a business, and we never thought about our business by saying, well, we're going to start with tax rates. That's going to be how we're going to decide on our investment. And I sat with the CEO of one of Canada's largest companies yesterday morning and said, we never lead based on tax rates. We think about the market opportunity, the availability of talent to develop that opportunity. And as we go through, tax rates are a factor. So we need to think about all those factors. How attractive is our market? Things like in the oil and gas sector, pipeline is critically important. How well positioned are we in terms of talent? We've done things like enabled people to get immigration happening more rapidly for high-end talent. So we've done some things and will do some things that are going to make a difference on competitiveness. Tax, then, of course, is something we need to consider as well. So I just would put it in the context of it's not central to our Canadian advantage. Mm-hmm. It's important. And I would, just as a final note, I would say that we've looked at the investment in business over the years, and it does not track changes in tax rates. It tracks changes in oil and gas prices. So that's the reality of how business investment has been tracked in Canada. So I don't have the counterfactual, what would have happened if we hadn't done all those tax changes. But I can say that we need to be careful to think that this is a silver bullet. It's not. We need to do more than this. And things like dealing with trade are going to be critically important as well. So there's many things we need to think about on competitiveness, and it's central to what I'm thinking about over the course of the next few months.
One of the competitive advantages that you've mentioned a couple of times in your answers is our labor force. There's a number of people, as you see on the screen in front of you, that are very interested to hear about what needs to be put in place to actually fulfill the future skills idea. I wondered if you could provide some examples.
Well, I mean, obviously, in the first place, you have to decide you want to do this, and then we did that in our last year's budget, putting forth money so that we could actually develop an organization that would be thinking about how we work together with educational institutions, businesses, and government to identify skills gaps, skills opportunities, and find a way to get more information to people as they think about their educational opportunities and their training opportunities. So that's what we're working towards right now. It obviously is something that our advisory committee and working together with them, we see as a gap. We see as people decide how they're going to manage their career dynamically, they need better information, and then we're going to need to think about how we direct our training budgets towards that, which will, by definition in Canada, require provincial, federal cooperation, which we recognize. So it's not straightforward. If it were, we'd already be there, and that's why, like other G7 countries, like other countries, we need to keep on this. So I think there's more to come. We certainly have some things that are critically important to get done.
If you were not the Minister of Finance and you got to be one of your other ministerial colleagues, which minister would you like to be?
Well, I think there are some questions you just decide not to answer. And maybe another way to say that is, I can say coming in from the private sector, it is an enormous privilege to have a job like I have. You get the opportunity to meet people and to hear about their personal issues and challenges. You get the opportunity to talk about how you can actually advance our country over the long term. There's an exciting aspect of working with people internationally to think about how we can make it advantage at places like the IMF and the World Bank. So there's multiple elements of really challenging intellectual opportunities. So I'm loving it, is the answer, and not aspiring to have another job.
There you go.
So far, so good.
There was a dinner with the National Chief last night, and he referred to you as, let me see if I can get this right, Sun Yao Yugi Mao. Okay. Do you know what that is?
I do. He gave me this, the I don't know what you call them, the Michael, what do we call them? Medallion? A medallion that you wear, and he put that on it. I can't pronounce it, but it means the money man, I think.
Big money chief.
The big money chief. So I think of it more as a target. So for him and his colleagues, that's certainly the way they think about it.
So even if you are the Sun Yao Yugi Mao, you can't do everything alone. There are a lot of people in this room who are very committed to this country. Obviously, that's why they're spending their time here. So I was wondering if you could speak concretely to what you need from the stakeholders in this room and beyond to really advance and enhance Canada's competitiveness.
Well, we need a lot, but let's start with the obvious.
You have 3 minutes and 48 seconds.
Okay, first of all, we've had a large number of Canadians step forward for boards and agencies and opportunities, but we still have a ways to go in terms of satisfying our goals of representing Canada in all of the institutions that the government has. And so people in this room, almost by definition, are among the most likely to be effective in doing that because they're thinking about issues that we're faced with. I think in terms of the next step, we need more people actually deciding to step away from roles that they have in business and academia and actually stepping forward to doing things. I was meeting with the CEO of a Crown Corp yesterday, who will go unnamed, but that person won't be in their job much longer because that person is going to take leave from there. And the concern is, how are we going to find the next person to do that job? And we together, we're brainstorming on how we do that. And getting people to come into public service is challenging. So stepping forward for those sorts of roles, and even if it's for 3 or 5 years, can be a big impact and enables us to get things done more rapidly. I would say that even in the Department of Finance, having people stepping in, taking time out, and playing a role. We have a couple of people in my department, one who was an absolutely top lawyer and one who was a top private equity person, who've come in and they're in my department and they are leading some pretty important files, one that might even be one we talked about today. to get things done. So there's exciting opportunities to think about the future of the country. And I'd encourage people in this room to think about that, because those are the things that certainly give me energy to get up every morning, and I'm sure for a lot of people in this room would have the same sort of impetus.
Is there a place they should go to put their name forward? How does this
Come
how
to
does
me.
this black box work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the black box is not quite as black as you think, because I think we're relatively accessible. But we've had people step forward, come to me directly, come to others among us, and it's resulted in positive outcomes already. So there's no secret. Just step forward.
Great. Well, there you go. We have our marching orders. Mr. Morneau, thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay. Off?
Thank you. I think so. Thank you.